Cyber attacks and hackers portrayed on television shows rarely reflect accurate cyber attacks that occur in real life. For ZDNet and Tech Republic, my name is Dan Patterson, and there is one exception. The television show Mr. Robot goes to great lengths to accurately portray what code and development and hackers actually look and behave like. Today, we're speaking with James Plouffe. He is the lead architect at Mobile Iron. He is also an advisor to the show, Mr. Robot. So, James, I wonder if you could tell me first a little bit about your background in cybersecurity and maybe how you became an advisor and consultant on a show that seems to value accuracy so highly.
Sure. I've been in IT about 20 years at this point. I've spent the last little while at Mobile Iron working through how we make our security and management platform work with other folks' security products. Prior to that, I actually spent a long time in enterprise IT. So most of my life, I have been a defender responsible for things like perimeter security systems. And during that life, I encountered some folks who shared my passion and interest for these sorts of things. Some of those folks moved out to Hollywood and turns out bumped into other like-minded folks, and one thing led to another, and here we are. So as you point out, Sam Esmail, the producer of Mr. Robot, and Cora Donna, the tech producer, both are really interested in an accurate depiction, and so they've brought folks in to help bring that to reality.
So I wonder if you could give a few examples for those who haven't seen the show of how Mr. Robot accurately portrays technology and cyber threats.
Definitely. I think one of the interesting things is exactly how committed Sam and Core are. So you see all sorts of things from the techniques. The main character, Elliot Alderson, begins some of the things that he works on, as a technology insider, and he's able to exploit his privileged access to certain systems by being on the inside. You see real life vulnerabilities such as stage fright, which is a vulnerability that affected a number of Android phones a couple of years back. And you see hardware like the Rubber Ducky, which is a human interface device emulator from a company called Hack5, which is very popular for penetration testing. And then you see tools like Kali Linux and Mimikatz and things like FlexiSpy that occasionally get deployed as well. I think the caveat with Mr. Robot is that the show is actually set in 2015. So while the threats themselves may be very, very realistic, sometimes they're not always the latest and greatest because it's a little bit retro.
Can you tell me a little bit about your process of collaboration with the show's writers and producers? How do you communicate sometimes very complex ideas for, at the end of the day, what has to be a piece of entertainment and often gets edited down to a 60-minute segment?
Yeah, that's a great question. It usually starts out with the writers kind of having broad arcs for the major plot events that they want to take place during the season, and so they have a couple of things that they need to do. And I think this is where, in many respects, the writing process sort of mirrors what an attacker might do while undertaking an operation against a target. You have to think about what your objective is, what your various options are, and so as we work through these things, the writers have an idea of what they want or need to accomplish in a series of episodes. The technical consultants put together a couple of pitches for tactics that might be employed to achieve those objectives. And then we kind of go back and forth, workshopping how those fit in and what sorts of things would need to take place. So it is a very interesting process in that regard. And I think it has caused me to perhaps think a little bit more deviantly than I normally would.
Hollywood has itself been a target of cyber attacks. When you collaborate with the writers and producers, do you find a level of sophistication and you simply refine or tune the technical details? Or is it like the old cliche of Star Trek where they would write the dialogue and then put brackets, Technobabble?
I think to the credit of the writers, they are a very well-informed bunch of folks, and sometimes they're in the wheelhouse, but the reality is that we all have a day job, and so perhaps there's a few places where things need tuning up, and it's never something as vague as Technobabble. They just, oftentimes you'll say that you'll get a script to mark up to say, this is what we're talking about, here's what so-and-so is going to say, is that correct? And you can fine tune it a little bit, or sometimes it's good to go.
Is there an educational opportunity that's presented by shows like Mr. Robot? Of course, we saw hacking really hit the mainstream with attacks that exfiltrated data from Equifax and Yahoo this past summer. Is there the potential in a show like Mr. Robot to really help a mainstream audience understand not just the risks, but also the threat actors?
Well, I certainly hope there's an opportunity there. As we live in a more and more connected world, we do need to be a little bit more cautious about how we approach that. And I certainly hope that the show's attention to detail provides folks with a basis to sort of think about how things really work. I think the liability with certain depictions of hacking in Hollywood is that they're wildly, wildly inaccurate. And so you can picture some of the memes based on CSI Cyber or NCIS, or hacking is just portrayed very, very obliquely. So it becomes this sort of deus ex machina, like we need to move the plot along. How are we going to have something happen? Someone can hack something and then we can keep moving. I think what Mr. Robot does is bring it home by using those very, very authentic examples so that folks can understand, hey, this is a real thing that really happens, and maybe I don't understand technically what's happening at every single level, but I can appreciate that this is a much more realistic depiction and therefore something that I should be concerned about.
The threats depicted on Mr. Robot are, like you just said, pretty realistic. They're also pretty extreme. Are there threats out in the wild now that are as dangerous or extreme as portrayed on the show?
Well, I think the interesting thing that we see is there's really, I would break threats down into two categories. You sort of have threats that are targeted at a specific objective. You often hear the term nation state actor or organized crime, folks who are setting out to achieve some specific objective. And certainly those can be very, very severe, but they're also fairly narrowly targeted. But then I think there's also a second class of threats that really are more threats of opportunity. And I would liken those threats to forgetting to lock your car door before you go in for the evening. So someone might be walking by and they wouldn't necessarily break into your car, but they would try the handle. And if it was open, they might toss it to find out if there was anything of value in there. And so I think, you know, as more and more personal data goes online and the value of that data increases, for example, the Equifax breach that you noted earlier certainly has a lot of high value data. So I think, you know, you'll see more and more threats increase in severity and certainly scale.
James Plouffe is the lead architect at Mobile Iron. He is also a cybersecurity consultant on the television show Mr. Robot. James, I wonder if you could leave us with a few predictions for the coming years. Ransomware, of course, really hit the mainstream this year. It's nothing new, but are there threats analogous that companies, government organizations, and NGOs should have their eye on going into 2018 and beyond?
I think ransomware certainly will continue to be a liability. I do think that probably the number one concern is going to be personal information that's stored online that can be used to perpetrate other types of crimes, such as healthcare or insurance fraud and other areas like that. So I would expect to see more targets at personal data rather than, you know, crypto ransomware would be my bet.